Great. All right, welcome. Thank you to those of you who are staying. Thank you for coming down to make it a little bit more of an intimate setting. And now we're moving into our third journey. And this is the part of the Transformation Journey program focused on the climb. And so the climb section of the Transformation Journey program, thank you. The climb section of the Transformation Journey program is focused on implementation. So after looking at what we saw yesterday was the instances where advocation partners and others were looking at how to take the tools that are included in the Transformation Journey program, such as the strategy continuum and the integral materiality process, and implement those in their organizations. So the climb is really about how that implementation unfolds. And so we have an example here from Lauren Muusse from ING. So ING was hosting, as you heard yesterday, one of our Transformation Journey programs in Amsterdam to complement the versions that were happening in Boston at John Hancock and here at Erasmus in Rotterdam. And so we wanted to use the opportunity to look at work that, this isn't work that was necessarily spawned by the Transformation Journey program. So this is work, just to be very clear, this is work that had already initiated, it was well on its way, but we see this as very much consistent with what we advocate for in terms of their implementation of the UN guiding principles on human rights in business into the setting of ING with its human rights report. And so this is something that we believe is a best practice, and that it specifically it achieves a norm, or it expresses a norm or threshold. So we believe that this is consistent with our thresholds and allocations based approach, and it's an idea that we've tested with John Ruggie, who was the UN Special Representative, who oversaw the creation of the UN guiding principles. So there's a kind of alignment here. So this is meant to be an example of the journey's level of ambition in implementation, and then we're going to move from a specific implementation over to Mairead Keigher, who is a Reporting 3.0 steering board member and with SHIFT. So SHIFT is the organization that really is taking the UN guiding principles and ushering them into implementation across multiple organizations. So we'll hand it right over to okay, I'm sorry, we had shifted that. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, I think. It's 12. I don't know if the sound works okay. Oh yeah, it does now, I hear it. My name is Mairead Keigher, and as Bill very nicely introduced, I work for an organization called SHIFT. SHIFT is a leading expert on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We're mission-driven. We're all about bringing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights to life, breathe them into institutions, into businesses, into policies, etc. It was established in 2011 after the unanimous adoption of the UN guiding principles at the UN Human Rights Council. And it was set up by two people who worked centrally with Professor Ruggie through his 6-year mandate at the UN, where he worked as the Secretary General Kofi Annan's special representative on the topic. And they set it up very purposefully because they didn't, someone else referenced this yesterday, they didn't want it to become a document that sat on a shelf and grew dusty. They wanted it really to be implemented and for people to take meaning from it and for it actually to permeate through business and through life. So I'm going to talk about that. And in a sense, it's a bit of a backdrop to what Lauren is then going to follow on with. But so why? So what? And actually, before I start, can I just get an indication from the audience of who knows anything about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights? So many of you do. That's great. So bear with me, because I am actually going to take a little bit of time to just go a little bit deeper into them to set up the context for what comes next. And I also think it's important because my perception over the last day and a half is that there's been a very heavy focus, in a sense, just from the speakers on the environmental, the ecological, which is extremely important and fascinating, and I really love it. But it's a luxury, possibly, to be able to put a little bit of attention on the social, so the people side of things. So thank you very much. So the guiding principles, as I said earlier, were unanimously endorsed in 2011 after decades of rancor in the UN between civil society organizations, governments, businesses, etc., all about how does the world hold businesses accountable for the negative impacts on people. And it comes back to the reference yesterday to the rights holders. Human rights is all about, it's really the language of human rights. Human rights is all about rights holders, who are the people who are potentially negatively impacted, or very obviously negatively impacted by actions of a business or businesses. So in a way, it's very simple. There are 31 principles split out across 3 pillars. The first pillar very definitely states that the government has a duty to protect human rights, that corporates have a responsibility to respect human rights, and that where issues occur, victims need to be able to find remedy, need to be able to access remedy. The very nice thing about it is the 3 pillars exist parallel to each other. So that means that even in the situation where the state doesn't live up to its obligations to protect human rights, businesses, corporations still have a responsibility to respect. And always victims should be in a position to be put right somehow. So that's at a very high level what they're about. In detail, what do they ask? And this is where we get into some of the fundamentals. And this is where I build on from what I've heard a lot of people say so far, the do no harm. What it's asking businesses to do very specifically is to prevent negative impacts to people from occurring. However, where they occur, businesses must address them. Okay, so this is do no harm plus. This is not do no harm. Do no harm is just don't do any harm. But acknowledging the fact that harm occurs, it always occurs, even when you do your best to mitigate and you put in the best due diligence processes, you must address, you must try to fix. You do this within your own operations, but also across your business relationships. And this is critically important, and this is where the debate moved on in 2011 from the previous conversations about spheres of influence, etc. This is saying that in the business relationships and across your value chain, you must look for those moments or for those instances of potential negative harm to people, and you must prevent them and address them when they occur. And then a few more details here. The first point here is key. It's all about risks to people. My own background, I actually realized I failed to introduce myself at the start. I spent 16 years with Microsoft, and 3 years before that I was with an ICT organization called DEC, Digital Equipment, that was bought out by Compaq, that subsequently was bought out by HP, so it's very legacy in a sense. But 16 years at Microsoft, and the final 8 years of Microsoft was within the legal and corporate affairs team, so very much focused on what we call citizenship, so the CSR, and policy, public policy. And when we talked about risk, we always talked about, or at least I certainly always thought about, what are the various ways that these political, environmental, economic, social, technological issues are going to impact on our business. Whereas what the guiding principles on business and human rights says, you have to turn the lens around. And the starting point should always be, how is my business activity in my own operations and across my value chain potentially going to impact on people? And who are those people? So it's a swivel, a turnaround of the lens that's very typical when it comes to risk management. This is in contrast to the standard definition of materiality that is used in almost every CSR report or sustainability report that you read, because what it says is when it comes to people and when it comes to human rights, you've got to flick the lens and you've got to start at the point of business impacting on people, right? And the stakeholders you talk to are not the media, They're not government officials. They're not civil society organizations. They're the people who are potentially impacted. So they're the communities whose land is taken off them. They're the people who are not being recompensed properly or paid properly in factories. They're those who have ended up in situations of bonded labor, etc. They're the stakeholders you talk to. You don't talk to all the rest. It's also about going beyond. This isn't about compliance. Human rights is not about compliance. What it's really saying with the UN Guiding Principles, in many countries, your national legislation is not going to be strong enough to protect rights holders. So you have to work towards the international standard, and the international standard is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And then finally, and I think this is really important, also when I think back to my own business experience, there are no offsets. When it comes to people, there's no such thing as a carbon offset. You can't cause harm to people or to communities in one place over here, and then over on the other side, contribute through your philanthropy arm or through, social impact activities to putting it right. It doesn't work like that. When it comes to business and human rights, you have to identify the potential risks to people, resolve them, and then on top of that, you can also address with the social positive contributions that you also want to do. But first, you put right what may go wrong. So that's what the UN Guiding Principles are about. And at a very practical level, it asks businesses to do three things. It asks companies to develop a human rights statement, a policy commitment, and to embed it through the organization so that it really becomes part of the DNA of the organization. It then asks companies to put in place a due diligence process that has at its core, and one element of it, public communication or public reporting, so the kind of formal reporting that all of you are very familiar with and that we all read. And it also, I'll cover that in a second, but it also asks companies to put in place grievance mechanisms so that those who are potentially impacted can flag it up or can report, have a way to give their voice back into the company and to raise an alert, and also then to remedy where an issue occurs. And all of this, the human rights due diligence process, revolves around what we call salient human rights, which are those human rights that are at risk of the most severe negative impact as a result of a business's activity within their own operations, but also across their value chain. Okay, so again, it's salient human rights. We very specifically don't talk about materiality. We call out those human rights that are at risk. Okay, so then that's just the backdrop. But what I also wanted to talk about was the work that we do reviewing existing reports and looking at them against the expectations of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And at a very high level, this is over the last 3 years that we've been doing this research, and it's done by hand, by person. All of it, 50% lack clear explanation of what those most critical human rights risks are that are facing their organization. 16% are silent on the governance of human rights. 80% only provide high-level information about the grievance mechanisms, etc. And then on the other side, there's the Alliance for Corporate Transparency, and many of you might be familiar with the work that they have been doing over the last year, which has been a kind of a pilot for a broader 3-year piece of research that will look at approximately 1,000 companies across the EU to determine the extent to which they meet the expectations of the EU non-financial reporting directive. 90% have a commitment to respect human rights. That's great. 36% of those, of the 105, explain a human rights due diligence process. 28% provide a statement on salient human rights, but only 10% provide details on the effectiveness. So net, what does it all mean? In reality, what it means is that the vast majority of the companies we're looking at, and we're looking at the largest companies, are not meeting the expectations of the UN Guiding Principles, net. So what can we do about it? Well, 3 years ago, we launched the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework. What we wanted to do was provide guidance to companies who had, since 2011, have been saying, but we don't know what to do. We can't really make head nor tail of the guiding principles. What do they actually need us to do, particularly about how we're supposed to report? There are so many conflicting reporting initiatives out there. We're not sure what we're supposed to be responding to, and we don't know how to put human rights information in. So we developed this together with Mairead, the accounting and auditing firm, and it all hinges around Part B. I think there's probably a pointer here, but oh yeah, here we go. Part B, defining the focus of reporting. In other words, what it's saying is that for you to do a really good, really meaningful report on human rights, and Lauren will explain later ING's approach, you must first start with identifying the salient human rights to your organization. And then you build Part C around it, the management of the salient human rights. So what are the stakeholders that you've engaged with? How are you integrating the findings and taking action? How are you measuring what policies, etc.? What it isn't is a sort of a format or a template for you to use when you're reporting. What it's supposed to do is help you pull together the contextual and the qualitative information that is crucial to human rights and management of human rights, but that typically doesn't exist in many sustainability reporting initiatives. There usually isn't the space for that. And so we're trying to help companies write meaningful information, meaningful disclosure that will provide all of that broad context. And the information then written in the company's own ways and their own voice can then be plugged into the various initiatives like GRI, like Workforce Disclosure Initiative, like whatever, in order to provide a comprehensive view of what human rights means and how a company is tackling their issues. I think that I know I'm out of time. All I wanted to say was we've also acknowledged that measuring performance when it comes to businesses and human rights is extremely tricky. And when you look through disclosure, you fail to find most of the time really meaningful information that helps you know whether the company is indeed having the right kind of impacts it wants to have. So we've brought together a group of people to sort of co-create and collaborate on exactly those kinds of indicators or those kinds of tools and guidance for businesses that are more meaningful when it comes, and more helpful when it comes to talking about performance. And it's a 3-year initiative. We're just we're clearly through the first year, but it's a very interesting one, and we'd be very happy to share more in years to come. But anyway, I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Lauren. You'll have to go back.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Preview.
Everybody close your eyes.
Yeah. So I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but human rights isn't exactly a sexy topic. I mean, I studied the topic, I've been working in the topic, and I feel like I'm invited to less parties now. So I want to start with maybe a lighter note. Maybe it's a bit disturbing, but it's been on my mind. Has anyone else been wondering if these boxers belong to Bill or Ralph? Show of hands, anyone? I mean, is it just thank you? Exactly. So hopefully I'll get some party invites that way. Now let's see how this works. So yeah, my presentation today is on human rights reporting, reflections on salience, due diligence, and the road ahead for ING. So I'm working within our Global Sustainability Department. In our Transparency and Disclosure Squad, we're separated into squads in our department. And within that role, so I work on disclosures. Human rights reporting is something that I've been pioneering and working on within ING, as well as business ethics. So that role sits within my team, and therein I am a human rights expert as well. So really deep diving into this topic. And my background is also in human rights. So not in Europe, but in North America, you have this field of study, Indigenous studies. So that was my 6 years of education in Indigenous people's rights. And then my background in the NGO world and research on the topic of Indigenous people and human rights. So coming into ING has been new for me, and that's one way to put it. But it also is something that I enjoy, and I really feel privileged to apply my knowledge in my everyday work. So really quickly in the next, I think I wasted minutes on my joke, so probably 13 minutes, I am going to walk through these things. So first, the identification of ING's salient human rights issues. So as Mairead set up, this is really the fulcrum or the focal point of a human rights report, and also of, we would say, implementing the UNGPs and also considering it as a threshold. So I'll walk through that at a high level of what we did at ING and then talk about the highlights from our reports. So in November of 2018, we published a report. I would encourage you to look to that source if you have any more questions. It's really the deep dive. I'll take you through the high level. And then from there, basically, what have we learned? How is this applying to due diligence? So what are we doing now? and then the road ahead for ING. So basically, the focus, again, as Mairead hopefully set up, is salience. And this is really unique in UNGP reporting and using the UNGP reporting framework, because in traditional risk analysis, you would, of course, look at risk to business as well as risk to rights holders. So rights holders do come in, but this lens alone at looking at what are our biggest risks on people is unique in the UNGP reporting framework and doing UNGP reporting. So although I loathe reading off of slides, this gives a little bit of context, so just bear with me and follow me as I read through this one. So this is an excerpt from our report. We're applying the United Nations Guiding Principles reporting framework as we demonstrate our commitment to disclose a highlight of our efforts in embedding respect for human rights into the fabric of our business, the salient issues we face in two of our operating roles as an employer and as a corporate lender, our dilemmas and challenges, the platform for the views and opinions of our stakeholders to be acted upon, and our future priorities. So at a really high level, this is kind of what we pulled out as really meaningful and what should be highlighted, I guess, in using the UNGP reporting framework. So this isn't a content index of how our report flows. It actually flows pretty closely to using the UNGP reporting framework. So therein there is a part A, B, and C, and that's kind of how the structure of our report works. But this is kind of the interesting points, at least I think, the UNGP reporting leads you to. And I guess the focus here, of course, what I have in red is that lens of salience and the difference between traditional risk analysis and using this topic of salience. So this is also from our report, but it's basically how we did our salience analysis. What I would like to point out first, and let me remember because I have 2 points on this slide. Oh yeah, okay, so the first one is that using the UNGP reporting framework and also looking at salience doesn't mean that you need to have all of your ducks in a row. So things don't have to be perfect before you begin with disclosures and before you begin this process. So for example, for us, and on this slide, you'll see at the top our role as a corporate lender, and then at the bottom there, you'll see our role as an employer, and we have other roles. So for example, other banks who've published UNGP reports, they would look at their role as a retail service provider or perhaps as an investor, and relevant for us would be perhaps the role as a retail service provider. That's somewhere that we have a really big area of our business. And essentially in this first report, we wanted to dabble, we wanted to start somewhere. We wanted to use the reporting framework and bring it to life in this realm of salience, and we knew that we were missing a role. So in the future, we would like to cover that. But I think how it relates back to the UNGP reporting framework is that it does really pull you to humility and pull you to start somewhere. It's pretty clear in the questions, in the relevant information that's in the reporting framework with guidance, that a company is drawn towards action, starting, and also humility. So that I think is something important to mention. And now the second thing on this slide, let me be reminded what I would say. Oh yeah, so the methodology is not prescriptive. So the UNGP reporting framework doesn't say this is the formula to analyze salience for everybody. There are foundational principles and there's a framework around it. So things like plotting severity and likelihood, a scale of an impact, the scope of an impact, and the likelihood of an impact occurring. So these are kind of the foundations, but then how a company would go about doing that is really up to them. And I think that's really meaningful, of course, because businesses are different, their impacts are different, even their work cultures are different. And I think talking about even work culture is meaningful in how you relate it back to how you do a risk analysis. So really high level, maybe this is a little bit dry, but I'll go really quickly in our role as a corporate lender, so at the top there. Not walking through all these steps, but this is really the focus of our report as well, our role as a corporate lender. So as an employer, we mostly employ, of course, people in developed nations, or maybe I should reframe that in the global north, you could say. And so our risks are not as severe as in our role as a corporate lender. So this is the role that we really focus on. This is where we see perhaps within the roles the highest potential salient risks, or where our biggest impacts of people could be, if you want to phrase it that way. Oh, sorry, I have to catch a breath. So I'm a little bit out of breath here, mostly because there's a human encroaching on my breathing space. So not because I'm walking around, I didn't just run a marathon, but I need to catch my breath. Anyways, okay, so what we did at a high level, we walked through, of course, the UNGP reporting framework. We attended a workshop by Shift with other experts and other banks. What we did at that top row, maybe don't read through everything, but we essentially reviewed all of the potential risks that we could be associated to through our wholesale banking lending portfolio. So we worked with a consultant to kind of classify our sectors as red, green, and yellow. So within these sectors, what are the risks, and then what are the sub-risks within those sectors? And then we focused on certain sectors. From there, our process was that we essentially took that traffic light system, and then we had pressure cookers and debates internally with our environmental and social risk team, with human rights experts, to plot the whole overview of everything we could be impact to on, again, these foundational themes of likelihood, severity, scale, scope, and remediability. So this is kind of the process we went through, and then we also validated with external stakeholders. So we hosted a workshop with some civil society organizations, and we talked about essentially our salient issues, how we got to them, and we tried to validate them. And this, I think, is an opportunity for honesty and transparency. So when we were doing that workshop, we had some really interesting feedback, and I think really meaningful feedback. So some of the civil society organizations, one thing that really came up over was, well, why did you include us at the end? Why didn't you include us at the beginning of this process? And we were kind of like, oh, face slam, duh. So of course, having this process, including stakeholders transparently, really helps you learn for if you are to do it again. And another feedback was, what about rights holders? What about engaging rights holders directly? Which I think is also really meaningful. And I mean, I don't want to defend the banking sector, and I think these answers, I get frustrated with answers when people say, but it's so complex, so we don't know how to do it. It is complex. There's ways to engage with rights holders, but the impacts we're talking about in our role as a corporate lender is through our clients. So our clients are the ones having stakeholder engagement mechanisms, grievance mechanisms on the ground. We have dialogue with our clients usually about this. We do meet with rights holders, sometimes in site visits or in roundtables, but primarily we're talking about through our clients. And I don't think Abby and Umbro's in the room anymore, but I have to give props to them as well, because on this important topic of rights holders, they had a conference at the end of 2018, essentially on innovations of how we could be talking to rights holders. So what are ways that we could have direct dialogue as corporates with rights holders? So it's an important topic, of course, that we're paying attention to and we hope to improve on in the future. So kind of high level there. And then as a result, so really quick, these are the salient issues I said in the role as a corporate lender that we came to. So land-related community issues, child labor, and forced labor. And I'm not gonna go into how we manage them, how we track them, how we understand them. This is all within our human rights report. So I would guide you there if you'd like a little bit more information. But that essentially is the focal point of the report. These salient issues, how do you understand them? And how do you manage them? How do you know that you are reducing impacts on people? So what have we learned and how have we found the UNGP reporting framework to be a meaningful tool? So the first thing that I want to say, and Mairead also pointed to this, is that tracking is somewhere where everybody, I think, is falling short, where people are falling short. So Part C of the reporting framework leads you to talk about tracking the salient issues. How do you know your management is going well on these topics? And it is difficult. So we did answer most of the Part C questions in our report. We also missed some of them. But now looking at what are measurements to know if we're doing well or not. For example, well, this isn't a salient issue of ours, but for example, say we measured year-on-year health and safety incidents through the clients that we lend to. If it changed year-on-year, what would this be telling us? If it went down one year, does that mean we're doing better, or does that mean our portfolio shifted? These types of things are complex, and we're thinking about how to manage and measure. And I should also mention with the Dutch banking sector agreement on human rights, so if you're not from Holland or if you're not familiar with it, I would point you to that to really see an amazing example of a cross-sectoral collaboration. And within the Dutch banking sector agreement on human rights, we are doing a KPI project, so I'm writing out essentially key performance indicators on human rights. So that also is really meaningful. The next thing, I have to look at my notes again, I want to say. Oh yeah, is that salience, of course, is a complex process. So it has to be lively. You have to keep doing it. You have to keep reviewing your own portfolios, but also entire sectors shift over time. So this isn't something that's just stagnant. These are our salient issues. This is where we focus. Of course, we focus on other human rights, but over time, we will need to keep reassessing. Oh yeah, another thing about human rights reporting that's important is that if there's any reporters in the room, anyone else who works on integrated reporting, It's that disclosures do spur action, and hopefully they would spur action if they're done well. So we have found that being transparent, having a platform, for stakeholders really has meant that people can ask us questions about it. So there's colleagues, oh, we have a human rights report now. What are our ambitions? What are our targets in 5 or 10 years? External stakeholders asking us, you have a human rights report now. When will your next one be published? When will you complete the Part C questions? So it really does spur action, I think, which is really meaningful. And linked to that, it also opens conversations. So within our organization, we did a salience analysis in our employee base, where we talked to a lot of employees, but also we have a highlight, for example, of procurement in our report. So as we were talking to procurement colleagues, this lens of salience, so looking and prioritizing risks to people first, was new, and I think that's pretty meaningful. Oh yeah, and of course it's resulted in revised policies, so we have a new environmental and social risk framework. Therein, we've included the salient issues, a little bit of a map of where the salient issues would fall in sectors, and this really makes it lively. Policy is like a draining topic, but I mean, within a bank, and as we are analyzing our clients on a regular basis using this policy, this puts people at the front office, so really on the front lines, providing finance, aware of what these issues are and how to manage them. So now the road ahead for ING. Okay, I have 2 minutes. So I think something that we're doing right now, and also related to our report and to salience, that is meaningful is we're doing proactive client engagement on human rights. So at the end of this year, we'll also be publishing kind of a report update of what we're doing on client engagement. But essentially, engagement usually happens on a risk basis. So if we see a risk with a particular client, we'll go out and we'll engage. We'll talk to them. We'll do a site visit. Perhaps we'll talk to rights holders, like I mentioned. But right now, we're going out and talking to high-risk clients proactively about human rights. So this is a way, in the Dutch banking sector agreement as well, that the language you use is using your leverage. So what we're doing is hopefully meaningfully using our leverage to influence our clients, to let them know this is important to us as the person providing your financing, and hopefully starting this conversation amongst clients. So I think that's pretty powerful, and you can look forward to an update in a disclosure. What else did I want to say? Oh yeah, well, of course we'll refine tracking. So with the Dutch banking sector agreement on human rights, we will look at ways to refine tracking and knowing if we're managing these salient issues well. And the last thing I want to touch on, and this is directly linked, I guess, to Reporting 3.0's work, is of course they are pioneering in the corporate field this discussion of thresholds. You could call it value creation within boundaries. So we've heard a lot about environmental thresholds. My colleague Floske will later present on how we're using thresholds to manage climate impact. But on the social side, things are really talked about less. I mean, the room isn't super full right now, and I think that's for a reason. The social in this conversation of thresholds is talked about less, and also the conversation of norms. So as Bill kind of pointed to, but as we are practicing, and what I really firmly believe, is you can use the UNGPs and the UNGP reporting framework as a norm to use as a management tool and a way to be spurring action on a social threshold in the here and now. And what that threshold is we were talking about, so I guess the social floor would perhaps be zero harm, but then using the UNGPs and the UNGP reporting framework, it would be in this context of remedy, prioritizing risks, things of this nature. But essentially, sometimes you hear in the corporate sphere an excuse. Oh, it's complex. Oh, we don't know how to measure the social. What are the measurements? So people kind of push it aside, but it's not a reason for inaction in the here and now. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to clarify the most important point here, that those are neither mine nor Ralph's boxer shorts. So thank you, though, that yes, that we will stay quiet on. So great. So I wanted to just, we have a few moments, and we do have a little bit of latitude since there was the transition time what's that? Oh, you have a question. Okay. Well, let me start with a question from here, just to really about sort of scaling up. So a different version for each one of you. So in terms of your specific question about, or your specific point about this notion that the UNGPs represent a norm or threshold. I'm wondering sort of to what degree you see that as understood both by other companies who are implementing it and by other stakeholders and rights holders who, in terms of their understanding of the significance of the UNGPs, and then I'll frame it slightly differently for you, Mairead.
I would say the practical application, is it still on?
Yeah.
The practical application of the UNGP, so for example, in through UNGP reporting framework, I think is a lot less applied and a lot less known. You saw also in Mairead's stats, kind of what the quality of disclosures and understanding is there. But the UNGPs themselves, so looking at the principles and that as a norm, I think is really well known. But then I wouldn't, maybe Mairead could answer this a little bit better than me, but then translating that norm into the applicability, I would guess is pretty low. But I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, we'll use that as a bridge, but then also, Mairead, if you could maybe speak more broadly about the, you showed some statistics around the uptake, which is not sort of blowing us away, is my takeaway. So, what can be done to enhance the understanding of the thresholds based, or this is a sort of a non-negotiable norm, and the uptake in particular, to sort of move those statistics in the right direction?
Okay. So probably the first thing to say is the UN Guiding Principles since 2011 are the global standard when it comes to business and human rights. They are the norm. That's not in question. And they form the basis of every piece of legislation globally that has come out since then. So they're very much the foundation of the French Loi de Vigilance, of the UK Modern Slavery Act, of the Australian Modern Slavery Act, of what's happening here in the Netherlands, of discussions in Geneva and Switzerland, etc., etc. So very much they are the global norm, the global standard. I'll come back to the point about thresholds in a second. I possibly am slightly less optimistic than you are, Lauren, about awareness and companies' knowledge and implementation of the guiding principles. I think there are still a lot of companies. I mean, the larger companies certainly know about it, have heard about it, have sustainability teams or human rights experts or whatever else. But I think beyond that top level, I think there's a massive gap, a massive dearth of knowledge, really, and awareness. What can we do about it? I'm very heartened by conversations that are happening and by work that's happening between SHIFT and GRI, for example, on trying to bring more of the language of the Guiding Principles reporting framework into the GRI sustainability standards. So there's a lot of work happening in the background for the last year or so when it comes to updating the technical standards for that. So I think that's very positive and will mean that more space is given in GRI, which thousands of companies are using globally to report on sustainability issues. And there's more activity happening for, even trying to work through the IOE and various other organizations, small and mid-sized enterprises. So there's a ripple effect. It's slow, but there's a ripple effect. We've also been doing some work with the IARC and specific companies within that to try and help them figure out how to add more meat from human rights to the social and the human capitals within their disclosure, and that's an ongoing thing. But there's a ripple effect, but I do feel it's a bit slow. Just come back to the topic of thresholds. Again, back to the do no harm, I actually think the lower threshold is do no harm plus remedy, plus action. I think that's it. That is the lowest base that every company should be doing. It's not enough to say do no harm. You have to remedy, or you have to take action where harm is found and where harm is done. So that's the lower threshold. In terms of upper threshold, this is where I think the UNGPs is slightly different to thresholds. I actually don't see a limit.
No. Right.
And I don't think a single company, even those that are doing very well, and Dutch companies in general tend to be leading the pack. I don't think any company has cracked it. And the problem is, an awful lot of it is contextual. You know, the environment changes, the operating environment changes, new products and innovations come out, and each time one of those things happen, there are different considerations that can change the severity of issues or can change the risk factors, etc. So it's as you say, it's an iterative process and it's a constant.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the strengths of it being called context-based sustainability or sustainability context, is that these thresholds are always contextual. They're never set in stone. So
Exactly.
Great. So we do have time for, okay, so we've got a question here, a question here, a question here, and a question here, and we've got, and Rado. So we've got, looks like 5 questions, and how long do we have? I think less time. Let's at least get the questions in the air, make it as concise as possible, and then if you can do synthesis of response.
Yeah.
Okay, lucky that I'm the first. As Bill said, context is very important to us, and I think there's a connection here, and I think that's what I also learned myself in the Transformation Journey programs, that climate change and human rights were 2 sort of separate issues in the past. And you also see that in the GRI guidelines, there are 2 different standards around them. What you see now through the work of Greta Thunberg and the Philippines government and many, many others, this merges into the view that a climate change abuse is a human rights abuse in the end, because in the end it affects us as humans on this planet. And you also see that now that a new term comes up, which is called climate justice, where you actually contextualize human rights and climate change into something context-based. So I think what we see outside on the streets just is the argument for the corporate sector to actually notch up dramatically on the UN guiding principles. And I just want to have your view on how you see that potential and how to best exploit that.
Okay, and
for the corporate sector.
Let's get the questions out to begin with. So if you could put your hands up again, great, thank you. And perhaps a little more concise than Ralph, that would be great.
I'm going to be very concise. Anthony Upward. My question is, where are we on third-party assurance?
Okay, good. Thank you for the concise. Over to Rado, I think.
I have a question around Shift's role vis-a-vis the investment community. I think you rightfully pointed that a lot of the materiality analyses miss out on human rights issues, and I think that's because we look at it from an impact on business perspective. Investors look at issues from a financial materiality perspective. So are you engaging that community, and in what ways?
Yep.
Okay, and a reminder that Rado, so as you're going up to Chris Dauma from PRI, Jesse, I'm gonna ask that, since you've asked a couple of questions already, that we'll hold off since due to the tight time constraint. So Chris, your question.
One question. So when the guiding principles were signed by the UN, John Ruggie was happy to get the signature of all the countries, but it came at a price, I think. And I'd like to ask, these 3 pillars of the guiding principles are protect, respect, and remedy. But what if a country does not protect, and the country at the same time is your business partner? And that happens in quite a lot of industries. So how does the reporting framework and how does a company like ING deal with these kinds of situations where your business partner is the government not protecting human rights?
Okay, great. So if you could just, in your responses, and maybe just go each of you in the reverse order, maybe Mairead first and then Lauren, just mention very quickly which one you're responding to. And you don't have to respond to all of them. Maybe between the 2 of you, cover them.
Okay, so Ralph, climate justice, absolutely. Entirely the way you bring those 2 conversations together, human rights and the overplay with the climate emergency. You know, and I love the work that Mary Robinson is doing through her Climate Justice Foundation and all of that. Specifically, we are seeing more of an opportunity now to talk to businesses about climate justice, and also how the climate emergency plays into the work that they're doing on human rights, and we're starting to have those conversations. We've written a couple of papers, for want of another term, for a number of businesses that just observes how opportunities we see for them to start talking more about this particular area. So without a doubt, this is a really important opportunity, and as you say, an opportunity for amplification of the underlying elements of the guiding principles in future. Yeah, completely agree. Anthony, third-party assurance. About a year ago, 2007, maybe it was more than a year and a half ago, the second part of the piece of work that we did with Mazar was the UN Guiding Principles Assurance Framework, which is a tool for internal auditors, external assurers, on how to think about how a company is working on and disclosing its impacts when it comes to business and human rights. So that's a tool that's out there. I would suggest, from what I'm aware of, it has slow uptake. But it's a very useful tool internally, but also with the external audience, and we would love to see more companies using it. I spot tiered. Maybe at some point he might be able to talk about how ABN AMRO has used it, because I know there was certainly initial discussions with Mazar about doing so. But I think in general it's a good point. The uptake is low from what I can tell.
Can I
yeah,
comment on that really
please.
quickly? And also with providing assurance, so there's also external parties who reward you with or for assurance, or also request assurance. So for example, rating agencies ask that information is assured, or investors ask for assurance, and they're not asking this on the UNGP reporting, on UNGP reporting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which probably goes to the next question, Rados, about the investor community. In 2015, a group of investors, institutional investors that are more socially minded, came to Shift and said, actually, we love the reporting framework, and we want to publicly express our appreciation of it, or whatever you want to say. So they signed a declaration. There are 88 of them. They're typically niche social investors, but however, they stand behind and publicly talk about and actually use the reporting framework, this little document here, when they go and they meet companies. So the questions, and it's to a point that actually Tiered mentioned yesterday when I was chatting to him, the reporting framework, though ostensibly it was produced to help companies know how to report on human rights, it's a brilliant road to managing your human rights issues, and investors use it. They ask these questions of companies. They say, so what are you doing when it comes to, stakeholder engagement, and how are the discussions you're having with stakeholders influencing decisions you're making back in your organization, and various other things like that. But it's prompting that kind of a discussion with companies. Again, I'd say slow trickle effect, but it can be a very impactful tool. Yes, there are about 88 of them. We actually were just talking to them last week, giving them an update on work that we've been doing and on future initiatives and various things like that. So I would love to be able to talk to more investors and get the likes of Larry Fink sitting in a room like this and let him really hear some of the nitty-gritty, but that's for another day, I suspect.
I suppose. So I guess the last question left for me to touch on is about countries, and when countries are your clients. And we treat, when countries are our clients, we treat them like other clients. So we have our environmental and social risk framework that they would go through. We also assess risks. We're not afraid to say no. We're not afraid to engage or also off-board countries. So for example, I work on business ethics. I give ethics advice on human rights. A few weeks ago, I did a deal where we were essentially, it was a national government who was the client, and there would be a product that would end up with the naval forces of this country. And it was technically within our policy. It wasn't technically on our high-risk country list. This product fell within our policy for the purposes it was going to be used for. But essentially looking and analyzing the history of possible human rights abuses by this particular naval force, we said no to the deal. So we treat them like any other client. But I should also say what's really encouraging is you see industry going beyond governments. And I guess an example, so the Ecuador principles, now there's EP4 coming out. And through designing these principles, there has been an independent study and now discussion on when governments don't do enough. So particularly Indigenous rights is my background, but the topic of FPIC, so free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous people and the use of their lands. basically there was a study within the Ecuador Principles that looked at how settler countries, so the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are doing on applying FPIC, because a lot of these countries have it in their constitutions or in law to be following FPIC, but we know that they fall short. So within the Ecuador Principles and Ecuador Principle banks, how can we go beyond what governments are doing and make sure there's adequate due diligence on this important topic of FPIC?
Okay, great. Thank you. And that was Equator Principles, not Ecuador Principles.
Oh,
I was mishearing
Equator. What did I
you
say,
on that.
Equator
Yeah, no. I think I was hearing it. So,
I might have said it wrong.
thank you, everyone. We will break for lunch now. Thank you to the panel. Wonderful session. I like session. I know a fair amount about this, and I learned a lot, so that's a good sign. So we're going to take a break. We're going to stick to the time. What time is 45? And though anybody, when you leave, so if you're leaving early, please return these, both for recycling purposes, but actually reuse purposes. So if you're leaving early, drop this off, but at the end of the day, drop it off. So thank you, everyone.